They used to say our land was blessed. That word was spoken often in my childhood, passed between mouths as easily as bread at the table, as if blessing were something that could be stored in timber and soil. I remember the way the fields lay still in the early mornings, mist lifting slowly from the low ground, the house standing above it all like a patient watcher. Even now, as my breath shortens, I can see it clearly, the whitewashed boards, the narrow windows, the steeple of the parish visible beyond the trees. It felt eternal then. Nothing that solid could ever turn against us. I speak now because the nights have grown longer, and sleep no longer protects me. When I close my eyes, I do not rest. I return. The memories come without mercy, each one asking to be named before I leave this world. I was taught that confession cleans the soul. I no longer know if that is true, but silence has become heavier than guilt, and I cannot carry both. I was born into the Harlan name in Virginia, when the century was still young and the land had not yet learned how to forget. We were church-going people. Scripture shaped our days, and prayer marked the hours like the ticking of a clock. My earliest memory is of my mother's hand on my shoulder as we knelt, her fingers thin and cool, pressing just hard enough to remind me to bow my head. It was the air in the rooms, the rule beneath every word spoken aloud. Faith was not something we questioned. The house was already old when I was a boy. Its beams creaked in winter, and the floors carried the soft hollows of long use. Candlelight softened every edge, turning cracks into shadows and stains into history. I believed then that houses remembered kindness the way people did. I believed walls held prayers. I believed that what endured must be good. My father never spoke loudly. He had the habit of pausing before answering, as though weighing each word against something unseen. When he read from the Bible, his voice was steady, but afterward, he would sit alone by the window, staring out at the land, as if expecting it to answer him. I mistook that silence for devotion. I see now it was something closer to fear. There were rules in our household that were never written. Certain rooms were not entered without reason. Certain names were not spoken, even in prayer. When I asked once about an older portrait hung near the stair, its subject scratched nearly blank, my mother only said it was damaged by age. I accepted that. Children accept what they are given, especially when faith teaches them not to doubt. As the years passed, I learned that prosperity can feel like proof. The crops held when others failed. The house was spared when storms broke across neighboring land. Men spoke of us with respect, sometimes with envy. In church, our family pew was always full, always present. I thought God watched us more closely than others. I did not yet understand that attention is not the same as favor. There were whispers, of course. Every place has them. I heard fragments when I was old enough to run errands alone, words that stopped when I entered the room, glances that slid away from my face. I was told envy breeds lies, and I believed that too. Belief came easily to me then. It required no effort, no cost. I remember the first time I felt unease without knowing why. It was evening, the light thinning. My father standing in the doorway of the study with a ledger open in his hands. His shoulders were drawn tight, his mouth moving as if counting under his breath. When he noticed me, he closed the book at once and told me to fetch more candles. His voice did not waver, but his eyes did. That look stayed with me longer than any sermon. Before I go further, while breath still comes to me and these memories have not yet scattered, I ask you to remain with me. If you wish to hear the rest of what was carried through this bloodline, stay, subscribe, and listen. I have no strength left to speak twice. I was raised to believe inheritance was a blessing, land, name, scripture, duty. No one taught me that guilt can be inherited as well, passed quietly like a family Bible, its pages worn thin by hands that never read the margins. I did not know then that memory itself can rot when sealed away, that what is hidden does not vanish but waits. As I sit here now, the house long gone, the fields no longer ours, I understand that my calm recollections were built on omission. The peace of my childhood was not innocence, it was insulation. Something had already been agreed upon before I learned to speak, something written not in ink but in consequence. I begin here not because it is the beginning, but because it is where the lie was strongest. The truth comes later, when faith thins and words fail. For now, let this be the last moment of quiet before the weight of it all is fully named. The first truth I learned was not spoken aloud. It revealed itself in patterns, the way rot announces itself in wood long before the surface breaks. I began to notice how certain years carried a tension beneath their harvests, how my father's prayer grew longer whenever my mother was with child. There was a way he watched her then, not with joy, not with fear exactly, but with calculation wrapped in scripture. I thought it was the weight of responsibility. I did not yet know responsibility can be a mask. In our house, births were recorded carefully. Dates were inked with precision, names chosen from a narrow list repeated across generations. But there were gaps in the family Bible, places where pages had been cut cleanly, not torn. When I asked about those missing leaves, I was told they had been damaged by damp. That answer satisfied the ear, but not the eye. Damp stains leave shadows. These absences were too deliberate. I remember the winter my younger brother was born. Snow lay thin and gray along the fence lines, and the river carried ice like broken plates. My mother did not sing that season. She moved quietly, conserving herself, as if sound itself carried risk. When the child came, he did not cry at once. The room held its breath until he did, and only then did my father sink to his knees, not in relief, but in something closer to resignation. He prayed longer that night than I had ever heard him pray. His words were steady, practiced, but his hands shook. I watched from the doorway, unseen, the way children learn to watch when they sense something is being hidden for their own good. I did not understand the shape of the fear yet, only its presence, heavy and familiar as furniture. The following weeks were marked by visitors I did not know, men who did not stay long, men who did not remove their hats indoors. They spoke with my father in low voices, their words stopping whenever footsteps approached. One of them carried a leather satchel he never set down. Another smelled of iron and old paper. They looked at my brother only once, and when they did, it was not with curiosity or affection, but assessment. My mother held the child tightly whenever those men were near. Her arms circled him, as if she could keep him from the world by force alone. At night, I heard her crying through the walls, not loudly, never enough to draw attention, but steadily, the way water wears stone. I learned then that grief does not always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers until it becomes part of the house. No one ever explained why my brother was sent away. That was the phrase used. Sent away, as if distance were a kindness. I was told he would be raised better elsewhere, given opportunities we could not provide. The lie was shaped carefully, smoothed, so it would not cut the tongue. I repeated it when neighbors asked. Children are loyal when loyalty is all they have. The morning he left, the sky was low and colorless. My mother dressed him in white, though it was not Sunday. My father would not meet her eyes. There was no farewell prayer, no hymn, only the sound of hooves on frozen ground, and the gate closing once, firmly, as if sealing something inside rather than letting something go. That night, the house felt larger and emptier at the same time. My mother's silence deepened into something brittle. She still prayed, but the words fell from her mouth without warmth. Faith, I learned then, can continue out of habit long after trust has died. I did not yet know that what had been done was not new, that it had been done before, and would be done again. Years later, when I was old enough to read the ledger my father kept hidden, I found entries that did not align with harvests or expenses, names I did not recognize, dates that coincided too closely with births, amounts recorded not as income, but obligation. Even then, I could not bring myself to name what I was seeing. To name it would have been to admit that the God of my childhood had been invoked as witness to something unspeakable. The guilt did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like dust, unnoticed until it coated everything. I began to understand that our prosperity had been purchased, not earned, that the calm of our household rested on an agreement older than my memory, carried forward because no one had been brave enough to let it end. I tell you this now because this was the moment the pattern revealed itself to me, though I lacked the courage to stop it. What was taken that winter did not scream. It did not bleed. It simply vanished into the machinery of our survival. And that, I think, is what has haunted me most, that evil can be quiet, orderly, and blessed by prayer. By the time I understood that what happened to my brother was not an exception, my childhood had already ended. It did not end with anger or rebellion, but with awareness, which is a quieter kind of loss. I began to listen differently then, not to what was said, but to what was avoided. In our house, silence had borders. Certain rooms carried it heavier than others, and certain dates passed each year without acknowledgement, like unmarked graves. My father aged quickly after that winter. His hair thinned, his back bent, and his sermons grew shorter, stripped of assurance. He spoke often of sacrifice, though never plainly. When he read from Scripture, his voice would falter at passages about inheritance, firstborn sons, and covenants sealed in blood. He would pause, clear his throat, and continue as if nothing had happened. The congregation heard devotion. I heard apology. I noticed, too, how my mother's faith changed shape. She no longer knelt. She sat rigidly in the pew, hands folded so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her prayers were no longer requests, but repetitions, phrases worn smooth by overuse, like stones passed between anxious fingers. She prayed not to be heard, but to endure. I learned from her that belief can survive, even when hope cannot. It was during those years that I found the second ledger. It was hidden beneath the floorboards of my father's study, wrapped in oilcloth darkened by age. I should not have touched it. I knew that even then, but curiosity, once awakened, does not wait for permission. Inside were records older than my father, written in a hand that was not his, then continued by him, as if by inheritance. 3 generations. That was all it took. 3 firstborn sons, each exchanged at the moment of greatest vulnerability, each recorded not as loss, but fulfillment. The language was careful, almost reverent. Words like due, kept, and balance appeared often. God was mentioned frequently, though never directly addressed. It was as if he were being cited as precedent rather than petitioned. I remember sitting on the floor with that ledger open, the smell of mildew and iron filling my lungs. My hands trembled so badly, I had to steady the pages against my knee. I searched for my brother's name, and when I found it, it was written smaller than the others, as if shame had tightened my father's hand. Next to it was a date and a single word I did not recognize at first. When I finally understood its meaning, I closed the book and did not open it again for years. After that, I began to dream of doors. Doors opening inward, never outward. doors that led to rooms with no windows, and floors that sloped gently downward. I would wake with my heart racing, convinced I had forgotten something important. My father said dreams were tests of faith. My mother said nothing at all. Silence had become her final defense. When my own wife became pregnant, the house changed again. Not in celebration, but in preparation. My father avoided me. My mother watched me constantly, her eyes filled with something close to terror. I told myself it would be different, that the pattern ended with us, that knowledge alone was enough to break it. I was young enough to believe that awareness equaled power. The night my son was born, I felt joy so sharp it frightened me. He cried immediately, strong and indignant, as if offended by the world. I held him, and felt something inside me crack open a tenderness I had never known. In that moment, the ledger felt distant, unreal, like a story someone else had lived. I promised him silently that no harm would come to him through my hands. But promises made in love do not always survive the weight of inheritance. I began to understand then how my father must have felt, caught between terror and duty, convinced that refusal would invite something worse. Fear, when dressed as responsibility, can justify almost anything. I did not yet know whether I would be strong enough to choose differently. I only knew that the house was watching, and the past was very close. I did not tell my wife what I knew. That omission became the first true sin I committed on my own. Until then, I had inherited silence the way one inherits land or debt, without signing for it. But that night, standing beside her bed, while our son slept between us, I chose quiet deliberately. I told myself it was mercy. I told myself fear would do her no good. Those are the lies men tell when they are afraid of being seen. My father came to the house 3 days later. He did not touch the child. He stood at the foot of the cradle and looked down with the same expression I remembered from my brother's birth, measured, distant, reverent in the wrong way. He spoke of lineage, of obligations that outlived individuals. He did not threaten me. He did not need to. The weight of his certainty pressed harder than any raised voice. That evening, he showed me the place. I had passed it my whole life without knowing what it was. A low structure near the edge of the property, half swallowed by trees and ivy. I had thought it a storage shed, or something left behind by a previous owner. Inside, the air was cold and dry, smelling of dust and old metal. There were markings on the beams, shallow cuts made by different hands over time, dates, initials, always the same month. My father spoke, as if reciting something memorized long ago. He said the agreement had begun in desperation during a year when the crops failed and the river rose. He said it had worked. The land had recovered. The family had endured. Each generation had paid, and each had been spared what came for others. He said, God understood bargains made to preserve blood. I wondered then which God he meant. I asked him what happened to the children. He did not answer at first. When he did, his voice was almost kind. He said they were taken somewhere. They would not be harmed further. That their suffering, if any, was brief. That dwelling on details only weakened resolve. I realized then that he truly believed this was mercy. Belief can be the most dangerous inheritance of all. That night, I could not sleep. I listened to my son breathe, counting each rise and fall of his chest, as if it were proof of time still belonging to us. My wife stirred beside me, unaware of the calculations unraveling behind my eyes. I tried to pray. The words came out wrong, tangled with resentment and fear. I understood then why my mother's prayers had turned hollow. Prayer offered no protection against choices already made. Days passed. Men returned to the property. The the same kind my father had welcomed years before. They did not speak to me directly. They spoke through him, as if I were already absent. I felt myself shrinking inside my own life, becoming a witness rather than an actor. Guilt does that. It convinces you that resistance is futile before you ever attempt it. I considered running. The thought came unbidden, sharp and intoxicating. I imagined packing in the night, leaving the land, the house, the ledger. But every path I pictured ended in the same uncertainty. Where does one run from an inheritance carried in blood? Fear followed me like a shadow, whispering of consequences I could not name but felt certain would be worse than loss. On the 7th night, my wife asked me what troubled me. She had always known when something was wrong. I opened my mouth to tell her everything. The words gathered, heavy and urgent. Then my son cried, and the sound cut through me like a blade. In that instant, I chose the lie again. I told her I was tired. I told her the land weighed on me. She believed me because love often chooses trust over truth. That choice sealed more than I understood. It taught me how easily silence becomes habit, how quickly one betrayal prepares the ground for the next. When the men returned at dawn, I did not stop them. I watched the light change through the window, and I told myself, I was not the one carrying him away. That distinction has haunted me more than the act itself. After that morning, time began to behave strangely. Days passed, but they did not settle into memory the way other days had. They floated, unanchored, like things I had refused to name. The house felt larger and emptier at once. Rooms echoed though nothing had changed in their arrangement. I learned then that absence is not a hollow, it is a pressure. My wife did not ask where our son had gone. That silence wounded me more deeply than any accusation could have. I watched her move through the house with a careful steadiness, as though the floor itself might give way if she stepped too firmly. She folded his clothes and placed them in a drawer she never opened again. At night, she lay awake beside me, her back turned, breathing shallow and precise. We became two people sharing grief without sharing truth. I told myself that grief required no explanation, that sorrow alone could bind us. That was another lie. Grief without truth ferments. It turns inward. I felt it working inside me, altering my thoughts, my prayers, my sense of time. I would find myself standing in doorways, unsure why I had entered a room. I would reach for objects I did not need, as if my hands remembered holding something they could not release. The men returned once more, weeks later, to settle accounts. They spoke politely, even respectfully. One of them thanked me for my cooperation. The word struck me with a force I could not show. Cooperation implies choice. I wanted to believe I had none, yet my silence had smoothed their work. My obedience had made their task clean. I understood then that guilt does not always come from what we do, but from how willingly we make space for it. My father died that winter. His passing was quiet, almost gentle. At his bedside, he took my hand and squeezed it with surprising strength. He told me the family was safe now, that the line would endure. I did not answer. I watched his mouth form words that had lost all meaning to me. When he was gone, I felt no relief, only the sudden weight of ownership. The inheritance had shifted fully onto my shoulders. I burned the ledger that spring. I told myself it was an act of defiance, a refusal to preserve the record. The paper curled and blackened quickly, the ink vanishing without protest, but the act brought no peace. Destruction does not erase knowledge, it only removes witnesses. The dates, the names, the pattern, all of it had already written itself into me. I carried it more faithfully than any book could. My wife grew ill not long after. The doctor spoke of nerves, of prolonged strain. He prescribed rest and quiet. I wanted to tell him that rest was impossible in a house built on omission. I wanted to confess to someone, anyone, if only to hear the truth spoken aloud. But confession requires a listener willing to bear it, and I had ensured there were none. I took to walking the property at dusk, tracing the boundaries as if repetition might alter them. The low structure near the trees seemed closer now, more present. I avoided it, yet my steps always slowed when I passed. Some part of me still expected to hear a child's voice, though I could no longer remember the sound clearly. Memory fades selectively, sparing us nothing but details. In church, I continued to kneel, to bow my head, to mouth the words. Faith had become posture rather than belief. I watched others pray with the ease of those unburdened by hidden bargains. I wondered if God listened differently to those who spoke without reservation. My own prayers felt rehearsed, cautious, afraid of revealing too much even to heaven. It was during one of those evenings, sitting beside my wife as she slept fitfully, that I first understood the true cost of what I had done. I had not only lost a child, I had traded away my right to be known. Silence had preserved the land perhaps, but it had stripped me of myself, and that realization, more than grief or fear, marked the point from which there was no return. By the time my wife died, the house had learned our rhythms of quiet. It no longer creaked in protest when doors were left unopened, or when lamps went unlit. It accepted neglect the way an old animal accepts age. I sat with her through the final nights, holding a hand that felt already distant, and I wondered if she knew, not suspected, not feared, but knew, in the way the body knows what the mind refuses to speak. She never asked me anything before the end. That mercy felt undeserved. After the burial, I moved through my days like someone who had missed a step on the stairs and was still waiting to land. People spoke to me, offered condolences, invited me to leave the property for a time. I thanked them and declined. The land was mine now in full, and I understood the cruelty of that statement. Ownership had been the reward each generation received for obedience. To abandon it would have been the only honest refusal, and I was too practiced in staying. It was then that I realized the bargain had never required repetition through ceremony. It persisted through habit. No new men came, no new agreements were spoken. The silence itself was sufficient. The land flourished again that year. The harvest was strong. I watched wagons leave the property heavy with yield, and I felt a sickness rise in me that no prayer could settle. Prosperity began to feel like accusation. At night, I dreamed of hands small, reaching, not toward me but away, as if pulled by something patient and unseen. I would wake with my fingers clenched, nails cutting into my palms. Sometimes I thought I heard a child's footsteps in the hallway. Sometimes I thought it was my brother, returned at last to ask why I had followed him into absence rather than stopping the path altogether. Memory rearranges itself when guilt grows too heavy. I avoided the structure near the trees for years. Then one autumn afternoon, when the light fell low and yellow, I found myself standing before it, without remembering the walk there. The door resisted at first, then opened with a sound, like a held breath released. Inside, the air had not changed. Dust lay thick on the floor, unmarked by any recent step. The beam markings were still visible. I ran my fingers over one set of initials, my father's hand, unmistakable. Beneath it, space left deliberately blank. That emptiness frightened me more than any mark. It meant the line could end with me, or that it had already claimed its due in a way not yet finished. I realized then that the bargain did not belong to the past. It lived forward, waiting for opportunity. Bloodlines do not end cleanly. They thin, they twist, they resurface where least expected. I thought of children I might have had after my son. The thought had never been allowed to settle before. Now it came with clarity and revulsion. I understood why my wife had grown distant, why illness had taken her so gently. She had known, in her own way, that bringing life into that house was an act of risk she could not bear. I had mistaken her silence for ignorance. It was restraint. In the years that followed, I became a man people described as kind. I gave generously to the church. I funded repairs, paid debts, supported families in quiet ways. Each act felt like an attempt to counterbalance something that refused measurement. Good deeds cannot be weighed against specific harm. They disperse, unfocused, while guilt remains precise. I learned that morality does not function as arithmetic. Faith, such as it was, returned in fragments. I found myself speaking to God without expecting reply. I spoke as one speaks into a well, not to hear an echo, but to empty the voice. I asked whether bargains made in fear could ever be forgiven. I asked whether silence could damn a man more thoroughly than cruelty. The answers, if they came, did not use language. By then, I understood that survival had been the least of what the bloodline preserved. What truly endured was the ability to live with contradiction, to pray and betray, to love and relinquish, to prosper and grieve without allowing any single truth to dominate. That skill, passed carefully from one generation to the next, was the real inheritance, and it was killing me more slowly than any loss ever could. It took years for me to admit that what bound the family together was not fear of loss, but fear of choice. Choice implies responsibility, and responsibility invites judgment. The bargain spared us that weight by narrowing the world to a single acceptable path. When every decision is already made by those who came before you, conscience has little room to speak. I had mistaken inevitability for fate, and obedience for humility. I began to notice how often I corrected myself, mid-thought, how frequently my mind avoided certain turns. The habit was older than I was. Even alone, even in prayer, I censored memory. Silence had learned to defend itself. I understood then why my grandfather's eyes had always drifted when certain subjects arose, why my father spoke of lineage with reverence rather than love. They were not hiding the truth from others. They were protecting themselves from knowing it too clearly. One afternoon, a boy from a neighboring farm wandered onto the property. He could not have been more than 8. He stood at the edge of the yard, watching me as if uncertain whether I belonged there. When I approached, he smiled without fear. Something in that expression undid me. I asked his name, and when he answered, I had to steady myself against the fence. The sound of a child speaking freely felt like an intrusion into a life I had sealed shut. I sent him away with a coin and a warning to stay clear of the trees. The words came out sharper than I intended. He nodded, confused, but obedient, and ran off. I stood there long after he was gone, ashamed of the relief I felt. It horrified me to realize that part of me still thought in terms of protection through exclusion, that the instinct to preserve the boundary had survived everything else. In the weeks that followed, I dreamed less, or perhaps I simply forgot the dreams more quickly. Memory had begun to thin, not gently, but in patches, like rot beneath paint. Faces blurred, dates slipped. I found myself unsure whether certain conversations had happened or merely been rehearsed in my mind. Guilt does not always sharpen recollection. Sometimes it erodes it, sparing the self by dissolving the evidence. I tried to speak once, to a minister newly arrived in the parish. He was young, earnest, unburdened by history. I told him There were sins that persisted across generations, that some families lived inside choices they did not fully make. He listened politely and answered with scripture about forgiveness and renewal. I thanked him and did not continue. Language failed me. There are truths too specific for doctrine, too particular to be absorbed into general mercy. What I wanted was not absolution. It was interruption. I wanted someone to stop the story from continuing forward, even if it meant destroying what remained of the family name. But interruption requires action, and action requires courage untrained by silence. By the time I recognized that, the opportunity had already passed. I had become the keeper of the quiet, whether I wished to be or not. I began to feel watched not by anything external, but by the past itself. Every decision I made seemed to carry an audience of the dead. I imagined them seated along the walls of the house, patient, approving when I maintained the old restraint. Their presence was not hostile. That was the worst of it. They did not threaten. They expected. It was then that I understood the true shape of the inheritance. Not bland, not prosperity, expectation. The unspoken demand that each generation justify the last by repeating it. To refuse would have been to accuse them all at once. I had lacked the strength for such an accusation, and so I remained, aging inside a story that no longer needed my participation to continue, only my silence. The years narrowed after that, not by number, but by texture. Days lost their edges. Seasons arrived without announcement and departed without ceremony. I noticed at first in my hands how they trembled, even when I was not cold, how they hesitated before touching anything as if permission were required. The body remembers what the mind has trained itself to avoid. I began to speak aloud when no one was present. Not prayers, not quite, fragments, names without context, apologies addressed to the room, to the air, to the floorboards that had absorbed more than their share of footsteps. Sometimes I thought I heard a reply not in words, but in the way silence deepened, as though leaning closer. Confession without witness is still confession, but it does not lighten the load. It only clarifies it. The house aged with me. Plaster cracked along familiar lines. The roof sagged slightly above the east wing where no one slept anymore. I stopped repairing things unless they threatened collapse. Decay felt honest. Preservation had always required lies. When the wind moved through the trees near the low structure, it carried a sound like breath through teeth, and I found myself listening for it, waiting for something to complete the thought. One winter I fell ill. Fever loosened what restraint had kept bound. I drifted in and out of awareness, and in those intervals, memory lost its discipline. I saw my brother as he had been before he vanished, not solemn, but laughing, dirt on his hands, asking questions no one answered. I saw my son only once, and that briefly. He did not cry. That absence of accusation was harder to endure than any imagined reproach. When I recovered, something essential had shifted. Fear had burned itself down to a low, steady ache. I understood then that whatever punishment existed had already been delivered, slowly, through years of conscious survival. The bargain had not spared us suffering. It had merely distributed it in a way that avoided spectacle. Quiet suffering leaves fewer traces, but it lasts longer. I walked to the structure near the trees one final time that spring. I did not go inside. I stood at the threshold and spoke aloud, what I had never allowed myself to shape fully. I named the dead as best I could. I admitted my part not as inheritance, not as pressure, but as choice. The words did not echo. They fell and stayed where they landed. After that, I stopped imagining futures. There would be no more children, no more names added or withheld. The line would thin and end not by courage, but by exhaustion. I felt no triumph in that knowledge, only a quiet relief that expectation had finally loosened its grip. To end a thing badly is still to end it. I returned to the house and sat in the room where my wife had slept through her last nights. The light came through the window, in a way it never had before, muted, almost kind. I realized then that memory does not demand preservation. It only demands acknowledgement. Everything else, land, name, blood, fades on its own. What remains is the knowledge that silence was a choice, and that I had lived inside it for most of my life. By the time evening came, I was very tired. Not the fatigue of illness or age, but the deeper weariness of someone who has carried a single truth too long without setting it down. I knew then that the end, whatever form it took, would not frighten me. I had already outlived my innocence. There was nothing left to protect. When I reached this age, people began to speak to me more gently, as though volume itself might hurry me toward the grave. They mistook my quiet for frailty. In truth, I had been preparing for this thinning for most of my life. Each year had peeled something away, first certainty, then faith, then even anger, until only endurance remained. What was left of me no longer resisted the narrowing. I stopped attending church in those final years, not from rebellion, but from honesty. The prayers sounded too complete, too confident in their conclusions. I could not stand among them without feeling like an intruder. My faith had become something private and unfinished, like a sentence abandoned halfway through. I still spoke to God, but not in the language of request. I spoke as one speaks to a witness who will not intervene. At night, memory returned without order. Events no longer followed sequence. My brother's face merged with my son's. My father's voice came from my own mouth. Time collapsed inward, folding generations into a single moment of recognition. I understood then that inheritance is not passed forward. It accumulates, pressing backward and inward until the present can barely breathe. I no longer tried to justify what had been done. Explanation is a young man's habit. Age strips it away. I saw clearly that the bargain had been sustained not by necessity, but by the willingness of each generation to call obedience virtue. We had mistaken survival for righteousness. That confusion had shaped every choice that followed. Sometimes I wondered whether confession mattered at all, whether speaking now, so late, served anything beyond my own need to be heard. But silence had already proven its power, and I could not allow it the final word. If guilt was my inheritance, then testimony would be my refusal to pass it on unmarked. Even an unanswered confession leaves a trace. I thought often of the children whose names I did not know, whose absence had been recorded only in margins and omissions. History has ways of honoring cruelty when it arrives wrapped in order and tradition. I wanted no monument, no defense. I wanted only this accounting spoken plainly, without the shelter of doctrine or excuse. My body began to fail me in small, specific ways. Breath shortened. Hands shook more openly now. Words sometimes slipped away before I could catch them. I welcomed these signs. They felt like permission. I had carried the story long enough to know it would not end cleanly, only quietly. In those moments when fear returned, as it still did, uninvited, I reminded myself that whatever waited ahead could not be worse than what I had already lived with. Judgment, if it came, would at least be honest. It would not ask me to pretend. That thought brought a strange calm, fragile, but real. I knew then that I was near the end of what could be said. The rest would be carried by silence again, but not the same kind. This silence would not protect. It would only close the mouth that had finally opened. and in that difference, however slight, I found the last measure of peace I was likely to know. I am aware now of how little time remains, not by any clock or physician's word, but by the way memory loosens its grip. It no longer arrives whole. It comes in fragments, like light through broken shutters, illuminating one thing while leaving another untouched. I accept this. There is mercy in not being able to hold everything at once. The mind, like the body, eventually chooses rest. I think often of the house, though I no longer sit within its walls. In my thoughts it stands empty, stripped of voices, its windows clouded but intact. The land will pass to others who know nothing of what it absorbed. They will walk its boundaries and feel only the weight of soil beneath their feet. I do not begrudge them that ignorance. Innocence does not need my permission to return. What I regret most is not the loss itself, but the ease with which I learned to live alongside it. Horror announces itself rarely. More often, it teaches you how to make room. It teaches you to wake, to eat, to pray, to age without ever naming what you have done. That lesson, learned too well, is the truest crime of my life. Everything else followed naturally once I accepted that arrangement. If there is judgment waiting, I do not imagine it as fire or voice. I imagine it as recognition, a moment in which nothing can be withheld, where every silence is translated back into the choice that formed it. I have lived long enough to know that such clarity would be unbearable and deserved. Still, I would welcome it. To be fully known at last feels like a kind of grace. I no longer ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness implies restoration, and some things cannot be restored without falsehood. I ask instead that the truth, once spoken, not be entirely wasted, that it settle somewhere beyond me, even if only as unease. Even discomfort can interrupt a pattern. Even a faint trace can alter a future I will never see. My breath shortens as I speak this. Each word costs more than the last. I can feel the body withdrawing its permission. That is, as it should be. I have said what I was able. What remains belongs to silence again, but not the silence I was born into. This one carries weight. It remembers. If you are listening, know this. Inheritance is not destiny unless you refuse to name it. What is unnamed grows patient. It waits. I was not brave enough to stop it early, but I am here now, at the end, breaking the surface at last. That will have to be enough. There is a stillness coming. I can feel it gather, gentle and indifferent. The room dims, not with darkness but with narrowing attention. I let go of the house, the land, the name. They no longer answer to me. I am tired of carrying what was never mine to keep. I will stop now, not because everything has been said, but because breath has limits. Let what remains fall where it may. The rest is quiet.